March 15, 1945. The Saarland region, Germany. Sergeant Wilhelm Richter pressed himself deeper into the muddy crater as American artillery shells whistled overhead. For 3 weeks, his depleted infantry regiment had held this sector against Patton's Third Army. He thought he'd seen everything the Americans could throw at them. The pattern had become predictable: heavy artillery preparation, fighter-bomber attacks at dawn, then Sherman tanks rolling forward with infantry support. His men knew how to handle it. They'd been handling it since Normandy. But this morning felt different. The American guns had fallen silent 10 minutes ago, too early for their usual schedule. In the darkness, Richter could hear tank engines. Lots of them, but they seemed to be holding position rather than advancing. Then he heard something else. A metallic clanking, like someone assembling scaffolding but amplified across multiple points along the American line. Corporal Klaus Hoffman crawled into the crater beside him, his face pale in the pre-dawn darkness. "Sir, the forward observation post reports strange activity. The Americans are bringing up trucks, ordinary trucks, but they're doing something to them. The observers can't make out what in this light." "Trucks?" Richter almost laughed. After everything, the Americans were bringing supply trucks to the front line? He raised his field glasses, scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. What he saw next would haunt him for the rest of his life. Part 1. The Weapon That Screamed. The first rocket launched at 4:45 a.m., a streak of fire that lit up the entire valley. Then another, and another. Within seconds, 60 rockets were screaming through the air, their sound unlike anything the German defenders had ever heard. The rockets weren't coming from traditional artillery positions. They were coming from what looked like ordinary Sherman tanks with massive tube arrays mounted on top. "What is that thing?" Hoffman gasped. Before Richter could answer, the rockets impacted. The entire German defensive line erupted in explosions. Unlike normal artillery that came in waves, this was instant saturation. 60 high-explosive warheads detonating within seconds of each other, turning carefully prepared positions into chaos. Men who had survived 3 years on the Eastern Front, who had endured massive Soviet artillery bombardments, stood paralyzed by this new horror. Private Hans Müller, 19 years old, would later write in his diary, "It wasn't like artillery or mortars. It was like the devil himself was shrieking at us. The sound went right through you, made your bones shake. And it came from trucks, regular American trucks." The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. Part 2. The Philosophy Gap. The German military had its own rocket artillery, of course. The Nebelwerfer had served on every front since 1941. German soldiers called them screaming mimes for the terrifying sound they made. But the Nebelwerfer was a specialized weapon requiring trained crews, special ammunition, and careful positioning. Each launcher had 6 tubes and took 90 seconds to reload. They were towed into position, set up, fired, and then quickly moved before Allied counter-battery fire could find them. It was precise German engineering at its finest. What the Americans had done was incomprehensible to the German military mind. They had taken ordinary vehicles, Sherman tanks, regular army trucks, and simply bolted rocket launchers onto them. No specialized chassis, no years of development, just brute force simplicity. A Sherman tank that could fight as a normal tank, then unleash 60 rockets in 10 seconds when needed. Trucks that could deliver supplies one day and devastating firepower the next. Major Friedrich Kohler, commanding what remained of an artillery battalion, watched through his rangefinder as 3 more Sherman tanks with rocket launchers moved into position. He had been an artillery officer for 7 years, trained at the finest military schools in Germany. What he was seeing violated everything he knew about weapons development. "They must be desperate," he told his adjutant. "Strapping rockets to tanks like some improvised trick. It can't be accurate. It can't be reliable." But it was reliable. Terrifyingly reliable. and the Americans seemed to have an endless supply of them. Part 3. Abundance as a Weapon. As the sun rose on March 15th, Kohler counted at least 12 of these rocket-launching Shermans, which the Americans called Calliopes after the musical instrument they resembled. But there were also trucks, regular 2.5-ton trucks fitted with arrays of rocket tubes, firing salvos of 36 rockets at a time. Sergeant Erich Braun, a veteran of Stalingrad and Kursk, found his hands shaking as he tried to rally his men. He had faced Soviet Katyushas, Stalin's organs, as they called them. But this was different. The Soviets had dedicated rocket trucks that everyone recognized. You could see them coming. Prepare yourself mentally. But when any American vehicle could suddenly unleash rocket hell, nowhere felt safe. "The Americans are insane," Braun wrote to his wife, though the letter would never be sent. "They put rockets on everything. Yesterday I saw rockets fired from a normal supply truck. Today from tanks that look like they have organ pipes growing from their turrets. They must have so much production capacity that they can afford to experiment like children with toys." What the Germans didn't know was that the American rocket program was indeed a product of their overwhelming industrial capability, but also their particular genius for practical improvisation. The T34 Calliope had been developed in 1943, but the Army had initially been skeptical. Too heavy, some generals said. Too vulnerable to enemy fire, others argued. The rocket tubes blocked the tank's gun when elevated. But American commanders in the field didn't care about doctrinal purity. They cared about what worked. If strapping 60 rocket tubes to a Sherman tank gave them instant devastating firepower, then that's what they would do. Part 4. The Psychological Collapse. The rockets kept coming all morning. Private Mueller, still alive in his shattered bunker, tried to count the salvos. His squad leader, a veteran of 5 years of combat, had given up trying to maintain any pretense of control. "How many rockets can they possibly have?" someone asked in the darkness. "All of them," the squad leader replied bitterly. "They have all the rockets." The American logistics system, incomprehensible in its scale to the German mind, could deliver thousands of rockets to the front daily. While German units carefully rationed their Nebelwerfer ammunition, sometimes having enough for only 1 or 2 salvos per day, American rocket units fired with abandon. A single Calliope could unleash 60 rockets, reload in under 10 minutes, and do it again and again and again. Sergeant Richter, still alive but with his regiment combat ineffective, tried to report to division headquarters. The field telephone lines were cut, so he sent a runner. The message was simple but devastating. Enemy employing new rocket weapon in overwhelming numbers mounted on standard vehicles. Psychological effect on troops severe. Cannot hold. Part 5. The Intelligence Failure. The runner made it to division headquarters but found chaos there as well. American rocket-equipped tanks had broken through at multiple points. Staff officers who had served since Poland were fumbling with maps, trying to make sense of reports that seemed impossible. Rocket-firing Shermans, truck-mounted systems, even jeeps with rocket tubes. "This must be a mistake," the operations officer insisted. "The Americans don't have specialized rocket vehicles in these numbers. Our intelligence would have known." But intelligence had failed them. The American ability to rapidly produce and field-modify weapons had created a capability gap that German doctrine couldn't account for. While the Wehrmacht spent years perfecting weapons, the Americans spent months mass-producing good-enough solutions. The T-34 Calliope was a perfect example. Was it as accurate as German artillery? No. Was it as sophisticated as the Nebelwerfer? No. But when 60 rockets landed in your position within 10 seconds, accuracy became irrelevant. The psychological trauma alone was worth more than precision. Part 6. The Philosophy of Abundance. General Hans von Kleist, observing the American advance from his divisional command post, couldn't hide his dismay. "This is not warfare, as we understand it," he said. "This is industrial brutality. They don't develop weapon systems. They mass-produce components and stick them together like building blocks. A tank becomes rocket artillery. A truck becomes a launcher. Tomorrow they'll probably put rockets on their field kitchens." His aide tried to maintain proper military bearing, but even he was shaken. "General, our intelligence reports they're producing these rocket vehicles in extraordinary numbers. Not in specialized factories. Just regular tank depots adding the rocket systems like accessories." Von Kleist's jaw tightened. "When we developed the Nebelwerfer, it took 3 years of research, specialized production facilities, trained crews who understood the ballistics, the chemical properties of the propellant. These Americans probably decided to do this over lunch and had the first units ready by dinner." He wasn't far wrong. The Calliope system could be installed on a standard Sherman in a matter of hours. When not needed, the rocket launcher could be jettisoned and the tank returned to normal combat operations. It was American pragmatism at its most brutal. Why spend years developing the perfect rocket artillery vehicle when you could bolt rockets onto existing tanks and achieve immediate battlefield superiority? Part 7. The Breaking Point. By noon on March 15th, the German defensive line had essentially ceased to exist. Not destroyed in the traditional military sense, but psychologically shattered. Units that had held against everything the Allies had thrown at them simply dissolved when faced with the screaming rocket barrages from seemingly ordinary vehicles. Corporal Hoffman, separated from Sergeant Richter in the chaos, found himself with a mixed group of survivors from various units. They had taken shelter in a destroyed farmhouse. An older soldier, a sergeant from a pioneer battalion, was almost philosophical in his shock. "I helped design fortifications, calculated exactly how much concrete needed to withstand bombardment, precise angles for fields of fire, everything calculated to the millimeter. And the Americans just cover everything with rockets, from trucks. The younger soldiers were even more shaken. They had been told repeatedly about German technical superiority, about V-2 rockets, about jet fighters and advanced tanks. But here were the Americans turning their standard vehicles into rocket launchers like it was nothing special. One private, barely 18, asked the question they were all thinking. If they can do this with trucks, what else can they do? No one answered. The implications were too terrifying. Part 8. The Captured Documents. When American forces advanced so rapidly they captured several German command posts intact, intelligence officers found revealing documents. Major Thompson, examining German maps and planning documents, showed them to his colleague. "Look at this. They've got detailed fire plans for their Nebelwerfers, precise calculations, optimal positioning angles, even weather considerations for propellant burn rates. They turned rocket artillery into a science." Captain Martinez laughed. "And we just strapped a bunch of tubes to a Sherman and called it a day." "That's the difference," Thompson replied, suddenly serious. "They perfect weapons. We mass-produce solutions." Among the captured documents was a personal diary belonging to a German staff officer. His final entry, written that morning, was revealing, "The Americans have broken the rules of warfare, not through superior technology, but through the absence of any rules at all. They put rockets on tanks like a child might tie fireworks to a wagon. It should be ridiculous. Instead, it is terrifying. We perfect the art of war. They mass-produce the tools of victory." Part 9. The Myth versus Reality. Here's what the Germans didn't know. The Calliope wasn't even particularly successful by American standards. Only about 200 were ever produced, far fewer than originally planned. The weapon had significant drawbacks that prevented its widespread adoption. Many tank crews preferred to keep their Shermans as traditional tanks rather than deal with the complexities of the rocket system. But the Germans didn't know this. To them, every Calliope sighting suggested thousands more. Every truck-mounted rocket array implied an endless production line of similar weapons. They couldn't conceive that the Americans would develop such weapons in limited numbers. In the German experience, if you went to the trouble of creating a new weapon system, you committed to it fully. The American approach, experimental, iterative, sometimes abandoned as quickly as adopted, was incomprehensible. The T-34 was just one of dozens of rocket launcher variants the Americans tried. Some worked, some didn't, but all were tried because America could afford to experiment. A captured German intelligence report from April 1945 revealed the depth of their misunderstanding. Enemy rocket artillery capabilities appear unlimited. Conservative estimates suggest thousands of rocket-equipped vehicles. Production capacity must be enormous. The reality? American rocket vehicle production was modest by American standards. But when you could produce 20,000 Sherman tanks, adding rocket launchers to a few hundred seemed trivial. Part 10. The Interrogations. Sergeant Braun, who had survived the initial barrage on March 15th, was captured a week later. During interrogation, his American captors were surprised by his questions. He didn't ask about his fate or the treatment of prisoners. He asked about the rockets. How many factories do you have making those rocket tanks? The interrogator, Lieutenant David Cohen, was puzzled. Factories? You mean depots? We just add the rocket launchers at maintenance depots. Braun stared at him. Maintenance depots? You mean you don't have specialized factories? Cohen shrugged. Why would we need specialized factories? It's just some tubes and an electrical firing system. Any decent mechanic can install it. Braun's face went pale. Any decent mechanic. The Americans treated weapon systems that would have required years of German development as an afternoon modification project. The conversation continued, with Braun becoming increasingly agitated as he learned more about American production methods. The rockets themselves were simple 4.5-inch models, mass-produced in factories that had previously made everything from refrigerators to automobile parts. The launchers were welded together from standard steel tubing. The electrical firing systems were adapted from existing tank equipment. "You must understand," Braun finally said, his English halting but clear. "In Germany, such a weapon would be a national project, special development bureau, dedicated factories, years of testing. You do this like adding a radio to a car." Cohen nodded. "Pretty much. If it works, we make more. If it doesn't, we try something else." Try something else. The casual dismissal of failed experiments, the willingness to abandon developments that didn't immediately succeed, the sheer wealth that allowed such experimentation. It was everything the resource-starved Wehrmacht could never be. Part 11. The Sound of Defeat. As March turned to April 1945, the rocket-equipped vehicles became a symbol of American abundance that transcended their military effectiveness. German soldiers began surrendering to any American unit, convinced that resistance was futile against an enemy that could so casually deploy such weapons. A Wehrmacht chaplain wrote in his journal, "The men no longer speak of tactics or strategy. They speak only of American rockets and trucks and endless supplies. They have seen the future, and it is made in Detroit." The reference to Detroit was telling. The Germans had learned that many of the vehicles were products of the same factories that had previously made civilian automobiles. The idea that car factories could be converted to produce military vehicles wasn't surprising, but the scale and speed of conversion was. And the casual addition of weapon systems to these vehicles, as if rockets were just another option, like heating or improved suspension, represented an approach to war that German military tradition couldn't accommodate. Private Kurt Wagner, 19 years old, captured in early April, told his interrogators a story that exemplified the German psychological collapse. His unit had been holding a crossroads well dug in with positions they had held for weeks against conventional attacks. Then we heard the sound, Wagner recalled. That screaming, like demons. My sergeant, a veteran of Russia, just dropped his weapon and said, "It's over." We all knew what he meant. If they have so many rockets, they can waste them on a crossroads. They have already won. The position was hit by 3 Calliope salvos, 180 rockets in 30 seconds. The actual casualties were minimal, as the Germans were well dug in, but the psychological effect was total. The entire unit surrendered without firing a shot. Part 12. The lesson. By mid-April 1945, American forces were racing through Germany, often facing only token resistance. The rocket weapons had become legend, their psychological impact far exceeding their tactical value. German soldiers would retreat at the sound of any rocket, convinced that American rocket trucks were hunting them. The reality was that most American units never saw a Calliope or rocket truck. The weapons were relatively rare, temperamental, and often kept in reserve. But the Germans believed they were everywhere. Every Sherman might be a Calliope. Every truck might unleash rocket hell. The uncertainty was paralyzing. Colonel William Harrison, commanding an armored battalion, noted in his after-action report, "The rocket weapons achieved a psychological victory out of all proportion to their employment. We had 3 Calliopes in the entire division, but the Germans believed we had hundreds. Their fear of our industrial capacity became a weapon more powerful than the rockets themselves." On May 7, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally. Among the thousands of prisoners were veterans who had survived the entire war from Poland to the end. When asked what finally broke their will to fight, many cited the American rocket weapons. Not because they were particularly deadly, but because of what they represented. Corporal Hoffman, who had survived that first barrage on March 15th, was processed through a prisoner of war camp. During his intake interview, he was asked what weapon he feared most. His answer was immediate: the rocket trucks. Not because they ended more lives than artillery, but because they showed us we had already lost. Any nation that can put rockets on trucks casually, that can use them on minor targets, that can produce them endlessly, such a nation cannot be defeated by soldiers. We were fighting against factories, not armies. Closing. The paradox of the Calliope. The Calliope would be withdrawn from service shortly after the war. The rocket trucks were converted back to regular transport vehicles. The entire American rocket artillery experiment of World War II would be largely forgotten, overshadowed by atomic weapons and other developments. But for the Germans who faced them in those final weeks of the war, they remained a symbol of American industrial might that was both crude and overwhelming. Years later, Sergeant Wilhelm Richter, who had survived that morning in the Saarland, would write in his memoirs, "We Germans always sought the perfect weapon. The Americans simply sought enough weapons. We built the V-2 rocket that could reach London from the continent. They put smaller rockets on trucks and won the war. There is a lesson there, though I am not sure we have learned it even now." The lesson was simple but profound. In modern industrial warfare, quantity has a quality all its own. The ability to mass-produce good enough solutions would always defeat the pursuit of perfect weapons. The Calliope, crude and inelegant as it was, had demonstrated this truth in the most visceral way possible. The screaming of those rockets, the sight of ordinary vehicles transformed into devastating weapons, the casual abundance of American firepower, all of it combined to create a psychological breaking point. The Wehrmacht had not been defeated by superior strategy or tactics. They had been overwhelmed by an enemy that could afford to experiment, to try anything, because they had everything. In the end, the Germans couldn't believe America turned ordinary trucks into rocket artillery. But that disbelief itself was the weapon. It represented a way of thinking about war that was foreign to everything the Wehrmacht understood. And in that gulf of understanding lay defeat. The Calliope was the sound of American factories, crude, loud, and absolutely unstoppable.